Vampires have historically taken many forms in Western media, usually being portrayed as beautiful and alluring, but before all of this they were known as hideous undead beasts. Their blood-sucking tendencies were feared all over the globe, from the Mesopotamian Lamashtu, the ancient Greek Strigas, and the Filipino Manananggal. Their forms differ from a lion to birds, but one thing stays consistent between them: the ability to sustain themselves off of hot blood. This is the one and only thing that will stay consistent throughout all of vampiric lore. It is what defines a vampire. The origin of the vampire as an anthropomorphic creature started in 18th century Europe, a grim place of poverty and disease. While Eastern Europeans were desperately searching for an answer to the disease that surrounded them, they were led to mass grave diggings and desecration of the dead, to which corpses with swollen bellies, blood at the mouths, long fingernails and hair were found. Today, of course, we know that these are all obvious signs of decomposition, and of course they aren't, proof that they're undead vampiric beings dwelling in the ground, but to a superstitious audience, it kind of is. After the rise of vampire superstition in Eastern Europe, vampires remained an undead fear, but they faded away a lot with the rise of modern industry. There are many vampiric works of literature in the 1700s, but none of them were so influential as the 19th century European works. The originator of modern-day vampires as creatures of beauty and sensuality came from the Italian doctor John Polidori. He was the travelling physician of Lord Byron and accompanied him on the famous Year Without a Summer, in which Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was produced. So, the people present in Lake Geneva in The Year Without a Summer were, of course, Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and Polidori. Another person who was also there is Claire Clairmont, who was the stepsister of Mary Shelley, Mary Godwin at the time. Another person relevant to the origination of the modern-day vampire is another one of Byron's ex-lovers, Lady Caroline Lamb. The affair with Byron and Lady Caroline Lamb ended especially awfully, and the book Glenarvan was written shortly after, in which the character Clarence de Ruthven portrayed an obvious caricature of Lord Byron in a pretty unflattering way. Anyway, the group started reading a collection of short German horror stories, Phantasmagoriana, to which Byron proposed that all guests, excluding Claremont, partake in a Gothic literature competition, to which Mary Shelley's Frankenstein obviously won. But another one of the greatest modern Gothic novels of our time was produced. That's John Polidori's The Vampire. It was the first modern-day vampire novel in which vampires are treated as creatures of beauty and attraction. Living in close proximity with his employer must have garnered a lot of hateful feelings towards Byron, because the vampire was a very obvious screw you to Byron, and the main antagonist, Lord Ruthven, who was also named similarly to Clarence de Ruthven, the antagonist and portrayal of Byron in Lady Caroline Lamb's book, was a very obvious and clear depiction of Byron, who at the time was dealing with a disintegrating marriage and rumours of incest. So basically, The Vampire was Polidori's way of saying Byron is the spawn of Satan and a blood-sucking fiend. It's not a great look, but since then, vampires have been portrayed as beautiful and attractive creatures of the night, rather than animalistic undead monsters, and it is all somewhat based on Byron. Ruthven travels across Europe, seducing young victims, mirroring Byron's own affairs across the globe, and it was so similar to the point where it was actually published as an original work of Byron, and both Byron and Polidori had to send letters to publishers and editors saying this was not Byron's work, this is Polidori's, and it is not plagiarised. This was kind of embarrassing for Polidori, especially since, this book had meant to be this huge screw you to Byron, and he kind of had to come and save him. But it did garner a lot of attention for the book, and it was very popular on its initial release. And since then, vampires have been henceforth known as aristocratic and beautiful, even if they are undead monsters. Another piece of vampiric literature that is important to note and will inevitably influence the perception of modern-day vampires is Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. It was unfortunately not as popular as other vampiric novels of the time, such as Vampire and the later novel Dracula. It is a novella, it's not a full-scale book, but it has everything a Gothic novel demands. Repetition of motifs, the dark setting of a castle, the manipulation of female virtue. It is, in my opinion, the perfect Gothic book. One reason that could be ascertained as a reason that Carmilla did not do as well on its initial release is that it focused not on the typical archetype of a male vampire at the time, but instead on the dangerous female relationship between Carmilla and Laura and the complexity between the two characters. While Carmilla, the vampire, still holds the typical traits of beauty and allure, she is, for me, the more interesting character to read about in comparison to a lot of other Gothic antagonists of the time, especially ones written by men. And despite being written by a man, the female relationship between Laura and Carmilla has layers of complexity that isn't just predator and prey, and Le Fanu establishes a layer of danger between them, but does not just establish them as simply two isolated characters in strife with each other. I think that's very interesting to read about. For me, Laura is the perfect victim of a vampire, since she is both repulsed by and attracted to the allure of a vampire. She is matched in her admiration with Carmilla in so much of the book. Laura reads, "I was conscious of a love going into adoration and also of abhorrence." And Carmilla reads, she would whisper, almost in sobs, "You are mine, you shall be mine, you and I are one forever." Le Fanu allows the sapphic overtones of the novel to kind of take over the book and transgress the expected romantic and sexual relationships of the 19th century, with Carmilla serving as the first female vampire in literature and a very clear queer aggressor. The female-centered Carmilla is the antithesis of the world in which Dracula will be created, but its ideals will still be carried forth into the most popular vampire novel of all time, Dracula by Bram Stoker. So, just to clarify, vampires have turned from blood-sucking animalistic monsters in early myths to a superstition based on medical fear that genuinely haunted so many Eastern Europeans, to them being romanticised and fictionalised by the Romantics and by Victorian authors as a source of Gothic excitement. The initial roots of the vampire have almost been forgotten, but one crucial link between them remains: the drinking of human blood. In 1897, Dracula was written and published by Bram Stoker. It's a book we all know about, but the story of its creation and publication is so much more interesting and important than many people often realise. So one thing that's important to know is 1897 was the height of Victorian censorship around sex and violence, and this indirectly caused some of the greatest sex novels to be created, so many of them being Gothic novels, and the most famous of them being Dracula. So even if you don't spot the blatant homosexual undertones of the entire novel, or just choose to ignore them, it's quite impossible to overlook the intimacy of a vampire bite, an action done on the neck, alone and in night, also being a form of sustenance for one, while the other, the weaker, suffers for it. This is so representative of the time in which Dracula was written, when prostitution was prevalent and casualised in Victorian society. To understand the world in which Dracula is set, it's important to understand the events that are going on behind it. Bram Stoker was a close friend of Oscar Wilde and created Dracula shortly after Wilde was persecuted and imprisoned for gross indecency. And Stoker also denied 20 years of friendship with Wilde. While the events cannot officially mean causation, the link is indefinitely there. Dracula is filled with transgressive sexual desire, and Count Dracula's character is so similar to the character of Wilde that emerged during his trials. David J. Scarr comments on this, saying, "It is no coincidence that Wilde was persecuted as a sexual threat to Victorian London, At the same cultural moment, Stoker created this greatest sex monster of all time. I wholeheartedly agree with this, and a lot of readers can recognise the link between the censorship of sex in Victorian London and the rise of Gothic literature, with authors fearing persecution in response to transgressive ideas about sex. Vampire biting scenes and death scenes are kind of the closest that they can come to writing about sexual intercourse. So, mid to late Victorian London, the vampire at this time is an inherently sexual being, with its whole concept transgressing typical norms and being presented as a sexual and humanitarian other. Despite vampires having so many human traits, namely passion, desire, and hunger, as well as their anthropomorphic appearance, of course, they are contradicted by their predatory danger towards humans and human society, being represented by their dwelling only in night, with their physical inability to roam in the day full of sunlight and human life. They thrive on the suffering of humanity, despite being so similar. For that reason, I believe that humans will stay a constant source of danger towards humans for decades or even centuries later. They can never truly be forgotten because they are integrated so deeply into human society. Humans and vampires are one and the same, with vampires representing all of our worst qualities. For this reason, it's no surprise that vampires are so interesting to so many people, including me.